The Ruy Lopez opening arises from pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, and knight to c6. Here, white plays bishop to b5, which is known as the Ruy Lopez, or sometimes the Spanish game. At this point, the main move by black is pawn to a6, challenging the bishop to make a decision. Usually, white retreats with bishop to a4, leading to various complex systems. However, the variation I suggest is bishop takes knight on c6, which is surprisingly effective at the amateur level. After this exchange, black recaptures with pawn to c6, creating space for the bishop. At this point, instead of capturing the e5 pawn immediately, white should play knight to c3 first, which is a strong move in amateur games. The reason white doesn't take the e5 pawn right away is that it doesn't actually win material. Black can respond with queen to d4, creating a double attack. Therefore, black will soon regain their pawn on the next move, which is something we want to avoid. However, after knight to c3, white reinforces the pawn on e4, making the threat of capturing black's pawn on e5 real. Now, the most commonly played move by black is bishop to d6. This move makes sense as it develops the bishop while also providing additional defense to the pawn on e5. A little later, I will explain how to respond if black plays other moves, such as bishop to g4 or knight to f6. But for now, let's focus on the main move, bishop to d6. At this point, white strikes at the center with pawn to d4, attacking the pawn on e5 once again. If black captures on d4, white recaptures with the queen, immediately putting pressure on the pawn on g7. Here is the key part of this variation. There is only one move that allows black to stay in 840 the game, and that is pawn to f6. However, this move has only been played by 30% of players according to database, which means that the remaining 70% play inaccurate moves that lose the game immediately. That's why I mentioned that this variation gives you a 70% win rate. You are likely to win at least 7 out of 10 games, possibly even more. Even if black finds pawn to f6, it does not give them any advantage. It only leads to an equal position. I will show you how to attack in that scenario later, but for now, let's look at the common mistakes that black tends to make. One of the biggest mistakes by black in this position is trying to defend the pawn on e5 by developing their knight to f6. While this move looks completely natural, it actually fails to pawn to e5, which creates a simple double attack on black's minor pieces. As we turn on Stockfish, you can see that the evaluation skyrockets. It's already plus 6.5, meaning white is clearly winning. One of black's pieces will be lost, completely ruining their position. This is obviously not the way for black to go, but if they make this mistake, it's great for you. So what else can black do? If they play pawn to c5, it's actually quite funny because white can simply capture the pawn on g7 anyway. At this point, black is practically begging to be destroyed. After capturing on g7, white attacks the rook on h8, and black's problems don't end there. The only way to defend the rook is to play queen to f6. However, after this move, white can trade queens, and once the queens come off the board, white can return to the usual plan with pawn to e5, maintaining a winning position. On top of that, you're going to win a piece anyway. Another move black might try against you is queen to f6. This time, they are defending the pawn on e5 while also offering a queen trade. They hope you will exchange queens, but instead, you can play pawn to e5 once again, creating a double attack on black's minor pieces. In this case, black has a way to escape losing a piece. They can play queen to e6, which pins the pawn to your king, preventing you from capturing. However, as black moves their queen around, they waste valuable time, giving white extra tempos for rapid development and an aggressive attack. A strong move I recommend here is bishop to g5. This simple development move not only prepares castling queenside, but also creates tension along the d8 square, putting additional pressure on black's position. So if the light squared bishop drops back, let's say to d8, you can even play queen to d8, delivering checkmate right away. However, in most cases, black won't play that move. Instead, they will play bishop to e7, which covers the square. Now, you simply castle queenside, and the usual response from black, since they need to untangle their pieces somehow, is pawn to h6. They hope that you will capture or retreat your bishop, but instead, you can finish the game in style with queen to d8, a really funny queen sacrifice. Since bishop takes d8 is forced, you then play rook takes d8, delivering checkmate. It's a quick win while black remains completely undeveloped. All right, now let's talk about the correct move, which statistically is played by only 30% of players, pawn to f6. In this case, I recommend that you castle queenside, as this also places your rook on the open d file. adding more power to your attack. To do that, you first need to develop your light-squared bishop, so you play bishop to e3. Black develops their knight, and you proceed with castling queenside, increasing the pressure along the d-file. Black will usually castle kingside, and now you can take advantage of the opposition between your rook and black's queen by playing queen to c4 first. This delivers a check, forcing the king to move. After that, you play bishop to c5, making use of the pin and increasing pressure on black's position. If black ever moves their dark-squared bishop away, you will be able to capture their queen on d8. But even if black doesn't make that move, the pressure is still unpleasant for them. For example, sometimes they play pawn to b5, which may look active at first, but in reality doesn't accomplish anything. After queen to d4, you increase the pressure along the d-file, and black's position is already lost. At the very least, they will lose a pawn, and you can continue attacking. Since we've covered the main line, let me also show you a few sidelines so that your opponents can't confuse you if they deviate. In this position, right after you play knight to c3, threatening to capture the pawn on e5, we have already covered bishop to d6, which is the main line. But what if black instead develops their knight by playing knight to f6? If your opponent does not defend their pawn on e5, you are free to capture it with knight takes e5. In this case, the most common move by black is queen to d4, aiming to regain the pawn. After queen to d4, they are attempting a double attack on your central pawns and pieces. However, you can simply play knight to d3, retreating the knight while simultaneously counterattacking black's queen. The funny part is that the most common move played by black in this position is knight takes c4. So black ends up blundering their queen in just one move, which obviously gives you a completely winning position. White wins 96% of the time, leaving only 4% for blunders or unusual play. But realistically, this should be a completely winning game for white. Another attempt by black to counter your threat of capturing their central pawn is playing bishop to g4. This move pins your knight to your queen, preventing it from moving. However, this move is actually incorrect. In this case, you can simply play pawn to h3, forcing black's bishop to capture because it cannot retreat. If it moves away, you will happily capture the pawn on e5. Therefore, bishop takes h3 is almost forced. Looking at the overall position, black now has doubled pawns, while you have a superior pawn structure. The only compensation for black is having the bishop pair, but that is not enough to make up for their inferior pawn structure. Therefore, if black is getting rid of their bishop pair, you are essentially left with a better pawn structure and an overall better position. For that reason, bishop to g4 is actually a positional mistake. After bishop takes f3, you recapture with your queen, and now your pawn structure is superior, plus you're ahead in development. Everything looks great. Let's say black plays knight to f6, you respond with pawn to d3, opening up your light-squared bishop. The most common move by black here is bishop to b4, trying to play actively. At this point, you can castle or play bishop to d2. Basically, any normal move is good. Bishop to g5 is a solid option, or you can challenge black immediately with queen to g3. This move, queen to g3, double attacks the two pawns, and usually your opponent will panic, thinking something has gone wrong, allowing you to easily win the game. Let me show you one possible line. If black castles and tries to defend the pawn this way, you can either capture the pawn or play bishop to h6, applying mounting pressure and even threatening a checkmate on g7. Notice that the pawn is pinned to the king, so it can't move. If it moves forward, black will lose their rook, leading to a decisive advantage. If black tries knight to h5, attempting a counterattack, you can counter their counterattack by playing queen takes e5, hitting the knight and once again securing a winning position. You're still applying pressure, and if black captures elsewhere, you'll be up a pawn, their king is exposed, and you have a significant advantage. If you found this video helpful, then like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.